Okay, I guess I got your attention. We are moving. You know, when we discussed doing the event in a ferry, somehow I didn't even compute that we would move. And as I said, you know, foot in a ferry, I can see that there is a movement, but we'll be okay, hopefully. So my name is Evan Epstein. I'm the executive director of the UC Hastings Center for Business Law, and I'm very happy to have you here with us. It's actually the 5th annual San Francisco Economic Outlook event that we partner with UCLA Anderson Forecast team. For us as a law school, it's great to partner with UCLA because of their forecasting economic side of things, which is different to what we traditionally do on the legal side, but it's always good to have these two areas. So thank you, Jerry, for the partnership. It's always good to see you. We talk a lot before doing this event on thinking about the what are we going to discuss? And as you can see today, it's about economic forecasting, but also we're going to talk about ESG. So for those of you who don't know what ESG is, you'll learn about that in a panel. We've got a fantastic panel. We have regulators, we have investors, we have advisors, and I think that is all very important for what we do. I also want to thank our students. We've got a bunch of our students from UC Hastings. So thank you for taking time to walk all the way here. But it's beautiful, right? We are in the water, so very different venue to what you're used to. And also I want to thank the Bay Area Economic Council for hosting us. This is their event. I think this is the 3rd or 4th event they do in this ferry. So we are kind of doing this together. So I'm really happy about it. So with this, I'll hand it over to Jerry and we'll get it started. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. It is a pleasure to be here once again in San Francisco. I started life on this planet here, not here, and up the road a little ways, but within the city. And there goes my clicker. A couple of announcements before we get started. Evan said the boat is going to be moving a little bit. That's supposed to be soothing and calming while we talk about recession. And we have a great program today. So I'm going to begin by talking about the US and California outlook. That's going to be followed by Sean Randolph, who's going to discuss the Bay Area and some of the issues that are confronting the Bay Area in terms of economic growth, both confronting and opportunities. And then we'll turn to our keynote. We have a great keynote today and our panel discussing ESG. A couple of things that I wanted to mention before we get started. One is restrooms, are right back there. So these are things that Jeff told me. The second is this ferry apparently was doing the Richmond to San Rafael run starting in 1924. We are not going to either of those cities today. We're going to stay here. So questions, I don't know how much time we are going to have for questions. We do have the reception afterwards, and so we can have a discussion then as well. But if we do, for our in-person audience, you can just raise your hand, and then for the audience that is virtual, you have a Slido number and you can put the questions in there. If we don't get to your questions, just email us. Be happy to deal with the questions over email. We don't want to leave things unanswered, although we're going to leave a lot unanswered today on things that we don't really know. We have the reception afterwards. And let's see. And the one thing that I didn't do was introduce myself. That was in my notes. So I'm Jerry Nicholasberg. I'm the faculty director of the UCLA Anderson Forecast, and I teach MBA students in the Anderson School. And my research was originally on monetary economics and economic policy, and lately it's been on transportation economics. And finally, before we get started on the economic outlook, UC Hastings College of Law and the University of California, Los Angeles are public institutions. And we really couldn't do these kinds of programs without the generous support of our sponsors. And I want to call them out and thank them. Our principal sponsor today is RSM. Our platinum sponsors, the law firm of Allen Matkins, Cathay Bank, Clark Construction, Leap Development, University Credit Union. At the silver level, we have Jackson Square Partners and Warland Investment Company. And at the bronze level, Manufacturers Bank. And at what we call the Bruin level is the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. And again, thank you to all of our sponsors. Okay, so that brings us to, and if George, you want to bring the slides up, to the US and California forecast. Is it on yet? Okay, that works. So starting out, I've entitled this The Uncertain Economy. And the reason why it's entitled The Uncertain Economy is we are in a position today in the US where there's more uncertainty than I think has ever existed in our lifetimes. And what that means is that as the economy, as the world unfolds, we really need to be looking at the data as it comes in to make decisions as to where it's going to go. So we're going to talk about an economic outlook. When I teach business forecasting, I shock my students by saying, okay, so every forecast you do is going to be wrong. But every forecast everybody else does is going to be wrong. And the thing that we try to do is not be too wrong. But if the economy or the business proposition starts veering away from our forecast, we want to know how to evaluate that and make corrections in our decisions. So let's get started with this. Critical questions. So the first thing that I think we have to understand is it's been a little over 100 years since we had a pandemic-induced recession. And we didn't have a lot of data and still don't have a lot of data on what happened with the economy then. And 30% of US jobs then were in agriculture. It was a very different economy. It wasn't as globalized as today. So when you hear people talk about this recession and this recovery, and they're relying on data from the recessions since 1945, which is when we started getting better data, they're talking about a little bit about apples and oranges, right? There's similarities, but there are also differences. So that we want to be careful about that, look at data and see what we can understand. And then some questions that we want to answer. Is the economy overheated in terms of inflation? And the second is Fed policy. Is a little bit of unemployment good for us? Is a lot of unemployment good for us? And then turning to California, what about this out-migration, everybody leaving California? And by the way, it reminds me of the Yogi Berraism. I don't know if he said it, but it was, that place is so crowded that no one goes there anymore. So we're going to get to all of that. So this is our roadmap, recession and inflation words. I think this is 16th Street steps. Pretty cool. And then end of the California dream with a question mark. 3 sectors in California. You want to look at government, logistics, and housing, 3 sectors that have the potential of driving the California economy. And finally, the California outlook. So that's our roadmap for today. And let's jump in with the US. And what you see here is GDP. The blues are actuals. One of the light reds is now an actual at 2.6%. And then the reds go out with our forecast. That dashed line is a 2.4% growth trend. And that's what we did in 2018 and 2019. And what you notice here is that we've got a dip in the 2020 pandemic recession. We come back almost to trend and then kind of slowly moves out, and we don't get back to trend in in any time in this forecast. And so the question here is, if we're not at trend, how can the economy be overheated? There must be a lot of potential. But when we look at unemployment, we see, so again, the blues are actuals and the reds are forecasts. We see we're down at, like mid threes. That's lower than we were when we were at full employment before 2020. So how do those things reconcile? And the way that they're reconciled is labor force participation. And so the left-hand graph that you see here is labor force participation rate of all people 16 years and older. And the gray shaded areas, if you can see those, are the recessions. And there's a long, let's go back. No, I went the wrong direction. And we're back to labor force participation. There's a trend here, a long downward trend, right? That preceded the recession. Big drop because businesses closed down. It came back and it's 1.6% below, but it came back kind of most of the way and now it's sort of a bit flat there. If you look at the right-hand side, that has a different trend. It has an upward trend. And it's an upward trend from 2010. And that is boomers. So what happened in 2010 was all those people who were looking at using savings from accumulated equity in their homes didn't have any equity, all underwater. So basically their retirement plans evaporated. And so they stayed in the, we went too far again. So they stayed in, this is really sensitive. Should be careful with it. So they stayed in the labor force. And the reason why it's a positive trend is boomers kept aging into this. Now you get to 2020, the economy shuts down. These folks are now 10 years older and they have equity in their homes, lots of equity in their homes, and they retire en masse. And this is a 9% gap. And you notice that on the left-hand side, people coming back into the labor force. On the right-hand side, you get some coming back, people who still wanted to work and continue to work, and then just flat lines, right? So that's a permanent reduction in the labor force. And if you have a smaller potential labor force, you have a smaller potential GDP. So that dashed line that we had, just lower the dashed line. And what you have is that we are at full employment and we're pretty much at potential GDP. We're just starting from a lower level. And that's going to be true going forward, that the base is going to be lower. And we're really not going to get back to that old trend without some increase in productivity, because we're just going to have a smaller labor force. Okay, so if we have tight labor markets, if we're at potential GDP, we have potentially inflation. And if you look at this, that's where we are today. All right, so that's the low eights, 8.2. So this is a non-rhetorical question. What's the inflation rate by headline CPI in the last 3 months? So we have a 6. Do I hear an 8? 8 is sort of right because it's 1.8. We've had 2 months with no inflation and then a little bit of inflation in the third month. So this 8.2 is year over year, but all of that inflation happened in the first 9 months of the year and not in the last 3. And we see that in the Fed's preferred measure, the personal consumption expenditure index as well. But if we look at this, and all of this is year over year, so it is apples and apples, and we look at where we're at today, and this is what the Fed is worried about. The 1970s, high and sustained inflation, right, that feeds on itself. But if we keep looking back, and that's much higher than today, but if we keep looking back, we've got 2 times when inflation looked like it did today, and then it just drops to 0. And those were 1947 and 1953. And what happened there was the GIs came home from war. They had lots of money. They wanted to spend that money, but the economy was oriented around doing wartime production. And so you had supply constraints, supply chain constraints until the economy adjusted to the new consumer economy. Here in the 2020 recession, we had lots of transfer payments. We come out of the recession. People want to spend money, but you have supply chain constraints. So how much of it is those arrows on the left-hand side, and how much is in the circle? And the answer is no one knows. Okay, but the Fed is worried about that red circle, right? And so what the Fed is doing is they're raising interest rates, and just did this week 3/4 of a point, in order to make sure that we're not in the red circle. But they don't know how much is red circle and how much is red arrow. But let's decompose this. So the last time we had high inflation in a month was in June. And so now we're looking at June 2022 to June 2021, and the inflation rate was 9.1%. And so this graph here that you see is a cumulative contribution to the consumer price index. And if we start from left to right, we see not much is happening. The second one there is alcohol. Alcohol prices went up. We're buying a lot more alcohol, but it's a small part of our budget. Now, I gave this talk to one group after they had had 2 hours at the bar. And they said, Jerry, know your audience. That's not true. But it is, on average, is a small part of our budget. And we start adding these up, and they don't amount to much. It's a little hard to see, but this is 2%, and you don't get over 2% till you get to automobiles, new and used cars. That's supply chain constraints. It's not that Ford doesn't want to sell more cars and sell more F-150s. They can't make them because they can't get the chips, right? So that's a supply chain constraint. That's why when you go into the dealership, you find out that that $45,000 car is a $60,000 car because of the supply chain constraints. The next one is shelter, and that is rent. So what these measures do is they take rent and then they apply it to all of us. So any of you who have a mortgage, you're charged rent in the CPI, even though increases in rent don't have any effect on you, right? But that makes rent 30% of this inflation metric, even though 2/3 of Americans have mortgages. So that's kind of a controversial point on this. And then we have a gap there, and that's the difference between core and headline, which used to be really relevant because headline included energy and food, and those were volatile. And the idea is let's look at the non-volatile, but now these things to the left are volatile. And since at least most of us consume energy and food, it is probably relevant. And those are 2 big things. So when Chairman Powell was before the Senate committee testifying about monetary policy, he was asked by Senator Warren, so you're raising interest rates to control inflation. How much does this increase in interest rates affect increases in prices in food? And the answer was, it doesn't. Food has to be produced. Higher interest rates is not going to bring more food to market. She asked, well, what about energy? No impact. And she didn't ask about shelter. What happens when you have higher interest rates is that people are squeezed out of the purchase market into the rental market. So you have increased demand and increased prices. So the Fed can't directly affect this. The Fed has a really blunt instrument, interest rates. And what they're trying to do is raise those interest rates, affect interest-sensitive sectors like home, construction, and automobiles, but automobiles are already in short supply, and business investment. And in doing so, reduce demand across the board, reduce employment. So people have less money, or they're fearful they'll have less money and they save more. And that will ease demand pressures and push down prices. And I kind of liken this to, you've got one of these little thin finishing nails and you're trying to put it in, to the molding at the bottom, and the only hammer you have is a sledgehammer. Sometimes it's going to work. Most of the time you're going to break that molding. And that's where we're at. But let's look at the data and not that analogy. And here it is. So this is the lines that you see here, they're red when they're going up, blue when they're going down. That's the Fed funds rate. And the dots on here are times when the Fed has changed its mind. Instead of raising rates, they lower rates. And there are only 8 dots on here. So remembering back to when you took a stat class, 8 observations, that's small sample world, really hard to do inference from it, but it's all we have. Of the 8 dots, 6 are red and 2 are green. The red ones are when the Fed changed policy, but they had already induced a recession because it takes time for policy to work through. And the green dots are times when it didn't, but there are only 2 green dots. So the Fed's trying to hit a green dot, it's more likely they're going to hit a red dot. And the reason is that current Fed policy is that they're not going to stop raising rates until such time as they see low enough inflation in the rearview mirror. If they continue that policy, we've got a recession. It's a 2023 recession. Because then it's too late, because they haven't seen the effect of all their recent interest rate increases. They've finally started this week of saying, that might not be a good idea. We're going to think about it. So we don't know if they've already sort of hit a red dot. They might have, but they might turn around in time. They might get lucky. And some of these supply chain constraints might ease enough in the next few months that that can help them get to that point. So that's what we have to look at. And in the forecasts that we're making, the one that you saw, where we didn't get back to trend, that assumes they hit a green dot. That might not be a good assumption. If we hit a red dot, our thinking now is mid-2023 because of these lags to third quarter of 2023. And it really depends on the Fed because the underlying economy is actually really strong. Why do I say that? Now I'm going to do what I told you we shouldn't do. All of the previous recessions that we've seen going back not to 1919, 1920, were about overbuilding. Building too many houses, building too many computers, building too much defense material. And we have none of that now. We don't have any sectors that are really overbuilt. And it may be finance a little bit, but finance itself rarely takes us into a recession unless it's associated with another sector contracting. Okay, so moving on, the Fed has headwinds. This is a purchase of goods, and this is the 2010 to 2019 trend. And as you go from left to right, you're going in time. And on the right-hand side, we're way above trend. It kind of flattens out there, but that's only because we now can buy services, which is a big part of our consumption. And so consumer demand, which is 70% of GDP, is strong. And with strong consumer demand, the Fed has a hard time unless they really push down employment. The other headwind that they have, and this actually is beneficial for California, is it's a much more dangerous world. I think I'm not saying anything controversial here. And that means that more defense spending is happening. There was a lot more in the current federal budget. There's going to be a lot more following that. And those defense durable goods require sophisticated components that we manufacture here in California. So that's going to be disproportionately beneficial for California, but it's overall it's increased demand. And our allies in Europe and Asia are also buying a lot more in the way of defense durable goods, and at least some of that's going to come here. So those are the headwinds. And with those headwinds, we have a forecast here of inflation coming down by the end of this year to 4.3%. Again, does the Fed think that trend is enough to pull back? Well, you know, they're going to have to pull back before that, because I was just talking about third quarter. So if we come back down from that 8.2% to 5.2, do they pull back? So this is something to watch. If we're wrong about how fast inflation comes down, there's a much better chance that the Fed will start easing back. And there are some critical assumptions here that you have to pay attention to if you're thinking about how this forecast could be wrong. Number one, COVID-0 policies in China. We've assumed that they have a decreasing impact on supply chains, and we're seeing workarounds in China. But we don't have a new regime in China, but we have a newly constituted Politburo, and they started out on the 20th Party Congress, National Congress, I guess they call it, by saying, hey, COVID-0 policies are great. We don't mind locking down. And so that's an assumption that the war in the Ukraine does not have a lasting effect on food supplies. And that goes along with the next one. The drought in the US, India, Northeast Africa also eases up. The bad news is the harvest in the Midwest this year was not so good. The pandemic does not deliver another damaging wave, but I think we've decided we're going to pretend pandemics don't exist anymore. So maybe that's not so important. Then political and geopolitical events don't upset the economy. Heroic assumptions. And so keep your eyes on those. So now let's turn to California. And I want to focus on one thing, which is this National Review Special Edition, Leaving California. And when you look at the picture here of people leaving California, you all will recognize that these are people who have hooked U-Hauls up to their cars and they're driving through Big Sur. I don't think they're going to Phoenix. I think they're going to Morro Bay, right? But California's lost 250,000 people in population of people moving out. So we do have to take it seriously and ask, what is the impact of that on the California economy? Is it the end of the California dream? And so let's start by looking at states and where's GDP being generated. These come from the 21 largest states. The other 29 individually amount for 1% or less of GDP. This is 81% of GDP. And the ones that I'm showing you here are, so this is from 2019 quarter 4 to 2022 quarter 2. So it spans that pandemic recession. And these are the states that grew faster than the US, so the ones that held the US up. And I've added one, our friendly rival Texas, which didn't grow as fast as the US. California is there in the top. There's a data error in that. So California before the revision was over here all the way to the left. But when I looked at the components of the data, it has leisure and hospitality declining in the first quarter of this year by at a 50% annual rate. While leisure and hospitality were adding a lot of jobs. So that makes no sense. So how many in the first quarter of 2022, January through March, cut back on going to restaurants? No one? Yeah, so that's a data error. But let's go with that. There are two ways you can get GDP to grow. One is add more people. If you have more people doing stuff, you get a higher GDP. And it's why China has the second highest GDP in the world and is still a poor country. They have 1.4 billion people doing stuff. The other way is to have increased productivity. And we know that during this period of time, there's a lot of migration in the US. So let's look at per capita income, taking account of the migration, and see how this changes. And even with California's GDP being underestimated by that data error, California is now in the top. Texas is negative. And you see Florida is way over here. A big part of that Florida GDP is Miami-Dade becoming the 6th borough of New York, with finance moving there. And so that brought in a lot of high income earners. And unfortunately, very unfortunately, the tragic Hurricane Ian that went through is going to shortly move that. And also the migration from New York of the finance industry is slowed to a crawl. That's going to go way to the right. So at least in GDP, looking backwards, California is not doing so bad, and those people really are stopping in Morro Bay. But let's look forwards. There are two graphs here. Look at the left-hand side. On the left-hand side is foreign direct investment. And these are companies that can go to any one of the 50 states. And these blocks here, if you can't see them, the first one's California. So more foreign direct investment coming to California. People are betting on California. This is 2021. Then Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, and Illinois. None of those are low tax states. If you look at the right-hand side, this is venture capital investment by state. California far and away the most. Then New York, Massachusetts, and Texas is 1/17 of California. So these folks who have skin in the game are betting on California. But just to show you that I didn't cherry pick 2021, here's the first half of 2022, and it's San Francisco Bay Area. I think none of you are surprised by that. Then New York metropolitan area, then Southern California. So that's a real growing area for venture capital investment, then Boston, then Seattle. And so those who are looking at the future, at least in the tech space, are betting on California. So let's look at kind of quickly a couple of sectors. This is the cumulative general fund for California for the last 4 fiscal years that are complete, and it's cumulative, so it's increasing left to right, and each year is higher than the last. What that's done is that's left, including the carryover to next year, somewhere between $55 and $60 billion that's available for the state to spend to smooth out expenditures. And that's unlike during the Schwarzenegger and during the Davis administration, when you had these big deficits and the state had to contract. So for state government, we're okay, unless we get a really big recession. Local governments, not so much, but the state has been salting away money for some time. Now turning to logistics, this is California seaport traffic, and you see that it's been increasing, and then over on the right-hand side, it's flat. Exports are declining because as bad as we think things are here, they're so much better than elsewhere, right? And so we're getting less coming in, or very little growth in seaport movement of goods. For our airports, on the left-hand side, that's SFO and LA. No, I think it's just LAX. Yeah, because SFO changed their reporting. So this is LAX, and we have an increase, and then it's kind of been flat for a little while. But our exports, which is the bottom line, also flat, but at a higher level. And on the right-hand side, we have domestic goods movement, and that's been flat. And what this tells us is that the big boom in logistics that has been an important part of growth over the last 3 years in California is probably over with. We're going to get some increase, but not a lot. And then finally, let's turn to housing. The left-hand side are home prices. Median home prices, they're down by over 7%, just about 8% now in California. But that's the median, so that's compositional. If you have fewer higher-end homes selling, the median, which is the point at which half of the homes sold are more expensive and half less expensive, the median comes down, but that's not all in the composition. Home prices are, on average, soft in California, and part of the reason is the right-hand graph, which is home sales, and they plummeted. So what's happening here is interest rates are going up. We've got mortgage rates, 30-year fixed mortgage rates in the mid-7s. And that means that the cost of a home at any price to potential buyers is now a lot more expensive. So buyers are saying, I need to pull back and wait and see where home prices go. Sellers are saying, I know I have to lower my price, but I don't want to lower it too much. So there's this price discovery going on. So expect this to continue. But in terms of home production in California, unlike in the US, we have an increase. These are the permits, and the permits have been going up. So with interest rates going up and permits going up, what's happening here? What's happening are bills that went through the state legislature over the past 3 to 4 years have opened up new products in home construction, most notably ADUs. And it takes about 3 years for that demand to be felt. In the county of Los Angeles, 20% of all new construction, all new units are ADUs. So we're bucking the trend because we've got new products. If these bills had passed 10 years ago, we would be right with the trend with a decrease in home construction. Okay, so that leads to a summary. Tech, government, and construction are expected to grow, but at a slower rate. Logistics, growth slowing to a crawl. The jobs that have been lost are in leisure and hospitality. That we're getting some of those back, and in other services, personal care services, those are the places where we still have a loss of jobs compared to pre-pandemic. Really, and this is just getting us ready for earthquakes. A little bit of shaking here. So we've got these job losses, but in part it's because that labor force that's pulled out is not there, and because job markets are strong and people have moved up out of, for example, wait staff in restaurants, and we've all seen this. But that increases the demand for technology, labor-saving technology, increases demand for other things we do in California. And then finally, defense buildup and infrastructure is going to strengthen California's growth. And so we're still going to grow faster than the US in spite of all of the challenges that we have. And that brings me to blank screen, which means let's turn and look at the Bay Area. And let me introduce Sean Randolph, who's going to talk about what's happening in the Bay Area. So thank you.
Welcome, everybody. We've done a number of these events in the past with the Anderson Forecast, and it's been a while, so it's great to be working again with Jerry and to have you on our boat. You probably noticed it's a boat. Don't be alarmed. There's nothing unusual going on here, but it does move a little bit. As Jerry said, we think it's soothing. Just think it's soothing. So I'm going to focus a little bit more and maybe more bullets and fewer graphs that you've been seeing on the particular topic of China, which looms over a lot of things having to do with technology, and how that kind of flows into and affects our economy here in the Bay Area. First one to go the right direction. Okay, here we are. It works. So if we go back, a lot of the story with China began when China became a member of the World Trade Organization back in 2001. And ever since then, Bay Area companies, especially technology companies, have been really at the center of an expanding technological web that links the US with China through trade, but in particular through investment. China from that date was really at the heart of the global offshoring model that aimed at worldwide markets. But as prosperity grew in China with their economy, more and more of our investment there was oriented toward domestic consumption in China. And with that, more Bay Area companies invested in China. Chinese started to invest here, and venture capital started to flow in both directions, but predominantly from the Bay Area toward China. So reciprocating some of the movement toward China in the mid-2000s, some of the large Chinese companies like Baidu and Tencent and others established technology offices here in the region. Chinese venture firms opened up here in the region, started to invest in local startups, and we were on to something kind of like a China boom here in the Bay Area. So the deterioration of US-China relations that really began around 2016, 2017, it had roots before, but that's kind of when you can see the turn starting, has pretty profoundly changed this pattern. And although important elements of the partnership remained, the landscape is really, really different now. And that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay. I think the most visible way we're seeing this is through investment. So US-China investment peaked around 2017. So if we take just one recent year, 2020, we can see the trend here. So two-way foreign direct investment between the US and China fell to about $16 billion due to the pandemic, disruptions, but also rising tensions in the US-China relationship. So this was the lowest level for two-way investment since 2009. And any new greenfield investment was flat. So US foreign direct investment going to China was 8.7 billion. That was a fall of about a third from the year before that and the lowest level since 2004. US investors launched fewer greenfield projects in China, and the slowdown in acquisitions in China that had been already pretty robust before fell even more than that. Sorry. So two-way venture capital flows, a very similar pattern. Again, these are flows primarily coming out of Bay Area venture firms. The two-way flow declined both in terms of deal value and the number of deals. US venture going to China dropped to the lowest level in 5 years. This was in 2020, measured by both deal value and deal count. Total investment, and this is a pretty dramatic figure, dropped more sharply. This is venture investment to about 2.5 billion. That was half of the 2019 level and a fraction of what we saw in 2018. So a dramatic fall off in venture investment. This was primarily a New York, Bay Area, and LA story. The vast majority of inbound investment from China was centered in those three metropolitan areas, a little bit in Seattle, but to a lesser degree. So a lot of what we're seeing here is in particular a Bay Area story. And we have to separate the FDI out from conventional investment and venture investment. The conventional investments that going into real estate, there was really not much political about that. It was really foreign exchange controls on the part of the Chinese government. So you had a lot of Chinese money going into real estate, a lot of downtown projects and towers, Chinese financed. That's not happening anymore. We're not suffering because of that, but they were a pretty major factor for a while. The fall off in venture investment is very politically influenced, largely because of recent controls or fairly recent controls put on by the US government on inbound investment in technology. So what happens next is going to depend on several factors. One is going to be the duration and depth of China's zero COVID policies. The other is going to be what happens with dual circulation, basically a series of strategies that ultimately really industrial policy tending to favor Chinese companies in the buildup of domestic champions, and how will our Bay Area, California, and US firms fare in the longer term under those policies. So this tells us what the pattern is, and you can see here, this is the venture investments, and you can see them going up and just going down. So the Chinese level coming here was always pretty small compared to the outbound, but it really went up in that period. It hasn't gone away altogether, but it's relatively down, but you can see just the massive drop off in the venture investment going to China. It's still going there. Companies like Sequoia are still investing in a pretty big way, but you can really see the drop. Let's see. Did I miss one? Oh, there we are. There's the total value of FDI between the US and China in this period. And again, you can see flat to falling, going to China, and then really China to the US, peaking in those years, 15, 16, 17, and then just pretty much dropping off a cliff. So it's maybe instructive if you look at it from a business standpoint to see what US companies are saying. And the most recent survey of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai gives a feeling for what's going on. So most companies there say they're profitable, and as they have been for quite a long time. About half are projecting year-on-year growth, but that's about a 1/3 drop roughly from levels reported last year, the lowest level of expectation in the last 10 years. More than half reported that their confidence in economic management in China had worsened. That's probably a lot to do to the COVID shutdowns. And I think significantly less than 20% rank China as their #1 country for global investment. And that's a really sharp drop from the previous year as well. Not a whole lot of optimism about the business outlook going forward. About 20% had reduced their investment in China compared to 2021, and zero COVID was really the major driver of that. So, for us, I think it's really important to see what they're saying about outbound investment to China, where more and more companies are looking at other markets besides China for their investment. Even though they're not leaving China for the most part, they're keeping a footprint in China, but they're shifting resources increasingly toward other countries and other markets. And about 1/3 have redirected investments that were planned for China into other markets. So where's that going? Probably the first destination of choice is Southeast Asia. Countries like Vietnam have proximity. I think India is another really large emerging market. A young growing workforce compared to China is looking really attractive in many ways. I think significant, one of our local companies, Apple, has begun manufacturing their newest version iPhone in China, the 14. It's been producing there before, but only older models. So they're not leaving Shenzhen, they're not leaving Guangzhou, but they're starting to diversify by moving some production toward India. And we're seeing more and more inquiries by companies, including Bay Area companies in Mexico, that has the advantage of the shortest possible supply lines and proximity, a 3-hour flight perhaps from the Bay Area, or even less from LA. And even Chinese companies, I think, are trying to slip in under that line to get into the NAFTA or the US-Mexico market. So I think really Vietnam, India, and Mexico are where most of our companies are looking at for opportunity. There's also another aspect of this where we're seeing some reshoring. It's not a massive movement, but significantly, again, Apple, about 180 suppliers, about 48 of those are manufacturing in the US as of about a year ago. And that's an increase of 25 from the year earlier. So Apple is sort of gathering its suppliers closer at hand, and 30 of those sites were here in California, and especially in the Bay Area. So you're seeing some drive toward proximity. It doesn't mean they're really not dependent on Asia anymore. They're heavily dependent on Asia, But again, you're seeing the move to diversify and diversify away from China. I think semiconductors offers another really interesting case now. Earlier this year, the CHIPS Act was passed, sent $52 billion to support domestic manufacturing in semiconductors. And part of that is to accelerate the shift of global supply chains for semiconductors toward countries and markets that are more aligned with the US, if not allies per se. With that, the US is also tightening controls on exports of semiconductor equipment and semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. And actually, interesting, export controls also carry the likelihood or the possibility of criminal liability. So that really makes it an interesting process if you're a company involved in the export sector, including for chips now. It's affecting our companies here, for which China is really historically an enormous market. Companies like KLA, Lam Research, have frozen their engagement with Chinese companies, including even support for equipment that's already been installed. Applied Materials just cut its sales projection for the current quarter by $400 million. It's a big deal. They generated 27% of their global sales in China last year. There was 1.8 billion. Companies like NVIDIA. So I think we're really seeing some interesting impacts in the semiconductor sector here. And one of the things that companies here say is, well, if we're cut off completely from China's market, then that may affect our innovation, our R&D, because a lot of the money we make in China gets plowed back into domestic R&D. So looking ahead, we just finished the Chinese Communist Party Congress. There wasn't a whole lot there that offers reassurance and relations with China are going to get any better anytime soon. We're still very, very entwined with China's economy here in the Bay Area. But I think what we're seeing today is that engagement is going to continue, but the scope for it is going to narrow. We're seeing growing restrictions on technological cooperation and investment. I think there's more restriction very likely coming from the Congress in the coming year, including possibly restrictions on outbound investment for security reasons in whatever may be deemed critical technologies. And why few companies are leaving China, I think there's a strong trend toward a reduced dependence on China, and at the minimum, they're looking to diversify. So just to close this, on the technology theme, it's not looking great with China, but the story isn't all about China. There are issues in the economy here. We know there's some high-profile companies that moved their headquarters last year, in the last couple of years, Oracle, Tesla, HP Enterprise, a few others. It's interesting, even though Tesla moved its headquarters in the same month, they announced a $1.5 billion increase in investment in the Bay Area. I think a lot of, even though the executives may leave, a lot of the staff in the R&D continues to be here. And there's a long pipeline of funded, fast-growing companies that are just kind of waiting to fill in behind the legacy companies that move on. So it's a negative dynamic still. We don't like to see anybody leave. It's driven by the cost here, which is a real factor. Housing especially, really catalyzed by the phenomenon of remote work, where people can live almost anywhere they choose. And there's a lot of cheaper places to live. But still, I think that the gravitational pull of the Bay Area for technology is essentially undiminished. I talked to a lot of venture investors, and almost unanimously they say that the critical mass in the Bay Area is going to keep it at the center of global venture investment and US venture investment and innovation for a long time to come. And global partners, when we think about the role that China plays, global partners, I think, have a big part to do with this. And so far, they've given a vote of confidence in the Bay Area's future as an innovation center. There are issues here. As you can see here, the number of deals plummeted. This is annual FDI in the Bay Area, plummeted during the recession. So we're going to see what happens there. Nobody is going back and forth. You couldn't fly, you couldn't be here. So we'll see what happens as we come back and people become more mobile. But to conclude, we asked earlier this year, because everybody shut down, they went home, and then we all sort of came back. What happened to the global companies, the global technology firms, the incubators, the accelerators, the R&D centers that were headquartered overseas? Did they all go home? Did they reopen? Was there attrition there? And so we interviewed them. We did a lot of surveys, and what we found was that it's a massive community. Really, almost everybody in the world is here in some form. A few left, but even more came in during the recession. So just to give you, I won't pause on these, but just to give you a sense of the scale of the presence here. These are European incubators, European accelerators, and government-sponsored innovation offices. And you can see just a wide range of European countries, accelerators, connectors for their business community here in the Bay Area. So very large, very diverse. And these are European corporate innovation offices. So we counted more than 80. There's probably more out there than that. You can see a really wide range, everything from fintech, a lot of automotive companies, telecom, biopharma, insurance, much anything anything. Hello, you're out. Pretty much anything you want to look at. So these are either large or they're small, but they're really designed to connect their companies and technologies into Silicon Valley and to participate in the economy here. And this number actually grew during the recession. Often they're associated with corporate venture firms. Often their global venture arm is located here. So you see a lot of those companies with their venture arms, and a lot of them are actually expanding their venture investment here. This is who we know is here from China. Of course, you know, the big companies like Baidu and Alibaba and Tencent are here. It's a shorter list than you would have seen 3 or 4 years ago. A number of Chinese venture firms have left, but there is still a Chinese presence. And again, there's the Chinese venture firms that are here. Again, shorter list than there was in the past, but still a presence. The Japanese are the big story. We found more than 100 Japanese corporations with R&D and innovation offices here in the Bay Area. Not one closed or left during the pandemic. Some are expanding. You can see they go into 2 pages. It's pretty much everybody in Japan. And their related corporate venture arms, very active, increasingly active. And then everybody else. A lot of the major Korean companies, I'm told there's a lot we missed. All the major Indian tech companies, and I know there's more we've missed, plus Australia, Canada, Taiwan, and a lot of other folks. So the conclusion of this is that while past high growth of our relationship, our investment with China is unlikely to return, trade's going to stay pretty strong, but investment is not likely to come back strongly. It's going to stay a very strong and important investment partner for the region and for the state and for the US. But as that happens, companies here are thinking more and more beyond China, thinking about how do they diversify, how do they spread their global supply chains for more predictability, more security, make them shorter. And the Bay Area, notwithstanding what's going on with China, looks to be still at a very important destination for global technology companies looking to focus on entrepreneurship, technology, and innovation. So a lot of uncertainty coming out of the recession. I think there's plenty of issues here in the Bay Area to deal with, but I think in the field of technology and global investment, I think the outlook is nonetheless very strong. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean. So a couple of things actually struck me there. One was the Japanese investment, and its foreign direct investment is actually huge in Orange County as well. And so that's and Japanese investment has always been strong, but even more so. And the other was the migration of tech out of the Bay Area, looking at change of addresses. The majority of that is following that venture capital investment to Southern California. So not leaving California, but maybe leaving the Bay Area. But now we turn to a part of our program that I'm really looking forward to, our keynote. And our keynote speaker has a bio that if I were reading the bio, she would not have any time. So I'm going to do this really briefly. Maggie Walderoder is a seasoned executive who, as CEO, has led both Fortune 500 companies and startups in her career. In addition, she has extensive board leadership, serving on over 35 public companies and 14 private company directors. And I mean, the list kind of goes on, but one thing that I discovered is that she and her husband have a winery and a really nice venue and small hotel in the Shenandoah Valley of California. I didn't know there was a Shenandoah Valley of California, but it's up east of Tahoe. But Maggie has deep experience in not just running companies, including in telecommunications, but also on boards and in corporate governance. And again, I urge you to read the whole bio. For being mid-career, it is incredibly impressive. And so join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Maggie Walderoder. Thank you. That's awesome.
Hi, everybody. If I could put this back in here where it belongs. It's great to be with you, and thank you for that nice introduction. My bio's long only because I'm old, so I've been around a while. But today I have the privilege to sit on 7 corporate boards, including Costco, Lyft Rideshare, Sana Biotechnology in the healthcare space, and I chair the DocuSign board. And then on the private side, I sit on the Legends Hospitality Board. We are the largest builder and landlord and runner of sports venues worldwide. We're owned by the Kroenke family of the Rams and the Chargers, the Jones family of the Cowboys, and the Steinbrenner family of the Yankees. So you can imagine what my board meetings are like. I'm on the Tanium board, which is a private company that's a leader in cybersecurity, mitigation, and eradication. And then I'm on the Sonoma Biotherapeutics board, also in the gene therapy healthcare space. So those keep me busy, in addition to being CEO of the Grand Reserve Inn, which I got a plug for, which is a luxury boutique 5-star inn in the center of my 80-acre wine vineyard. And my husband grows grapes and has been making wine for 35 years. So we're very blessed to be in the Shenandoah Valley, which is between Sacramento and Lake Tahoe. So come and visit us. But I'm here also to talk a little bit about corporate governance. I've had the privilege to run startup companies in tech, and ran a Fortune 500 for 12 years when there were only 4 women doing so in the United States. And so I've seen scale, I've seen growth, I've seen different levels of innovation, and sitting on 51 corporate boards in my career, going on my first one at 28, also has given me some pretty good insights. So I thought I'd just start from a governance perspective and talk a little bit about public versus private. I don't know if any of you are ever interested in getting on a board, but it's a great way to learn case studies about different companies, business models, and how they operate. Basically, on the private company side, they typically meet 4 or 5 times a year. Standard meeting time about 2 to 4 hours. Usually there's 5 to 7 board members on a private company board, so they're smaller. And there's typically an audit or compensation committee that would be part of a private company governance structure when a company reaches about $300 to $400 million in revenue. Before that, the board acts as the nom and gov comp and an audit committee as a group. They don't necessarily break things out into committees. They're definitely more operationally focused from a board perspective. I kind of look at it this way: when you're in the private environment and you're on a board, you're nose in and hands in. So you're helping that company operate. But when you're on a public board, you're nose in and hands out. You know, you're basically overseeing, but you're not doing anything. There's a pretty hard line on operations. A lot of private companies are mostly family and founder oriented, focused more from that perspective, usually with a controlling shareholder who makes the ultimate decisions. So many times on private company boards, you're more of an advisor than someone who is the decision maker, which is also different than public. And again, when you think about these boards, a lot of them go public. Many of them, probably about 20%, stay private their entire lives of those companies. So the public markets, as you've seen some of the economic trends today, have been very wide open, especially for young companies to go public over the last 5 to 7 years. That trend has slowed down to a crawl, basically to nothing right now, based upon the changes in the economy. And in the Bay Area alone, 396 tech companies have laid off people in the last 60 days. So we're seeing a contraction in terms of this flywheel we had, that people can, if they didn't like the company they were working at, they could get another job in about 10 minutes. And that's actually changed quite a bit. So on the public company, just to kind of give you a comparison to private, public companies typically meet 8 times a year. So double what private companies meet. Usually 5 to 6 of those are in person and the others can be virtual. Sizes vary from 8 to 14 board members because you need enough board members to actually populate SEC required committees. So you have a chairman of the board, and then you have committee chairs for Nom and Gov, audit, and compensation. Board members of public companies are typically elected by shareholders on an annual basis. Sometimes it could be over a classified versus declassified board. You might have a 30-year board elected every year. So over a 3-year window, the entire board would be up for election. And there's a lot of focus on diversity of gender, race, experience, skills, collegiality, which is really important for respect in the boardroom, building on ideas, asking questions versus making statements, being trusted, confident, and also at times courageous based upon what's going on with companies. And we need a lot of courage in the boardroom these days. So the other thing I thought I would do is just mention some hot topics, and then I'm going to do a little deeper dive on ESG. So strategic pivots is one of the priority things that boards are focused on, both private and public. Looking at the balance sheet, looking at the core assets of companies, the competitive assessment for those companies and their right to win. How do they grow? Is it organically? Is it by M&A? Is it by expansion into new markets or adjacencies or different product sets? And are they domestic or are they international in terms of what their focus is? So those are kind of the major strategy topics that are looked at from a board perspective. The second is human capital management, an extremely important topic, I think, for all of us. Boards do provide oversight of the culture of the company, the values, the compensation philosophy of the company, the locations where workers will work from, whether that's home, an office, or multiple locations in any of the countries that they serve. There's retention. There's basically diversity and inclusion oversight by the board. And then policies, and we've had a lot of new ones that have popped up over the last several years, including things like vaccinations, return to work. You know, are you going to have all remote, or how often do you require people to get together? The third hot topic is digital transformation. We used to look at digital as a technology company environment, but today every company is digital. Every company is into technology. And it's really about simplicity of how companies are doing business for competitive advantage, whether you use a platform, if you use data and analyses and you integrate that into your motions of how you run your businesses. There's a lot of reengineering going on. There's a lot of operations analytics. Many companies have also moved with some of the challenges for employees to robotics and really replacing maybe some of the lower cost jobs in those companies with technology instead. Another hot topic is cyber security. Trusting and safeguarding priority data. In the boardroom, we talk about data like not all data is equal. You want to make sure you're picking the right data in order to protect it. How do you do that when workers are remote and data is prevalent everywhere? Has been big challenges for many companies. I think we all know it's a terrible situation when these companies are being held hostage with ransomware. And making sure from a board perspective, we know what companies are doing to detect, problems, to protect the data. How fast can they respond? How do they deal with breach isolation in their networks and their systems? How we train employees. The number one reason why companies get hacked from a cyber perspective today is senior executives answering emails that are phishing emails. That's the number one. So making sure that your executive, I know that they all want to be responsive, but sometimes they get their companies into trouble by doing so. So training is really important throughout the entire organization. And then whether you have cloud or you're on-prem with all of your data and vulnerability analysis, which has to be done really every year because the situations continue to change. Some of the other topics include risk management, which today is about supply chain, employees, customers, the financials of a company, operations of a company, and crisis management, and making sure those things are put in place as well. A couple other hot topics, I'm not going to go through all of them, are enhanced disclosures, go-to-market shifts, which we've seen a lot of, especially in the Bay Area, in terms of direct sales or digital interactions with customers, partnerships, international expansion, customer success, data management, and shifts in composition of the boards themselves. Because in order to address the right hot topics that matter for companies in any stage that they're in does require different expertise on their boards as well. So I thought I would just move over to ESG and talk a little bit about the best practices for 2022 that we're seeing in companies and also at the board level. The full board does maintain regular visibility from companies. Companies are putting together really across the board, both private and public, visibility and what they're doing in order to have full oversight of what's happening with ESG. We also in companies are looking at taking a specific aspects of ESG and dividing it up for our boards. What's handled by Nom and Gov committees is different than what's handled by comp committees, which is different than what's handled by the audit committees. So, and people in the companies are assigned to these committees too. So it's a work together with the companies on how they're thinking about this strategically and also how they manage ESG. So in the Nom and Gov area, they have a central oversight that's given to them from the board of directors. They focus on social responsibility. They focus on environmental impacts and sustainability, and there's a lot going on with climate change and legislation, both at the state level and the federal level. And then we also focus at that level from an ESG perspective on board refreshment on diversity in the company, and taking a look at the numbers of male versus female in companies, not just from a percentage perspective, but from a level perspective in the company, looking at who's at a director level and above, and how diverse is that part of the workforce versus your front lines. And doing the same with director and board succession, and making sure that we have diversity on our boards. The ratio still of even male to female on corporate boards in the United States. Women make up about 30% of the board members. That has gone up by about 10% in the last 12 to 18 months. I run a board boot camp at my inn for teaching women and underrepresented minorities the work of the board, how to secure a board seat intentionally, and then how to be successful as a board member once they got on a board. I've trained 350 women as an example over the last 2.5 years. I do it gratis. It's part of my philanthropy to give back. And I've placed 75% of them on their first corporate board within a 12-month window. So we're seeing diversity change in the boardroom, and making sure that our board members are prepared for what that work is important. So on the comp committee side, it's executive compensation from an ESG perspective, pay equity and pay ratios. So it's not just making sure we have the right diversity in our companies, but they're being paid appropriately for the work that they do. The practices of diversity, equity, inclusion that are built into how the company operates. Human capital management across the board, leadership development programs and processes for developing leaders from within. And then executive succession planning. What boards do is we focus not just on the CEO, which is our primary responsibility, but the direct reports to that CEO and one level down. Because at the end of the day, you're trying to build capability and capacity for all senior level jobs at the company at the top of the house, and having 2 levels prepared to have CEO candidates within the company as well. And then we also review employee surveys when they're done, and employee polls. What I've seen too is a number of companies are actually doing surveys more on a quarterly basis with their employee base, because it's continued to change in terms of expectations and also satisfaction, and using that as a guide for any changes or pivots that they might do at the ESG level. And then last but not least is the audit committee, which is more of a supporting role in ESG. ESG risk identification and oversight is done at the audit committee level because it does create risks to the organization. Audit committees do review ESG success measures and initiatives that companies have in place and what the outcomes are for identifying emerging risks in those areas. Establishing with management ESG disclosures that we would do, especially on the public company side, and the transparency associated with that. And then also reviewing and establishing with management the controls and procedures for ESG within the organization, which again continues to shift. And there's not a cookie cutter process for ESG in companies today. It depends on the industries that these companies are in. It depends on the stage that the company is in, the types of products and services these companies create or support, and their customer base as well. So it's an evolving field, I think, for all of us, but it's good to see, at least I've had the privilege of seeing this in corporate America continue to change and be a higher priority on the human capital side. So with that, I'm going to actually stop talking, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have on this subject or anything on your minds from a corporate perspective. Sure. Yeah, thank you. The question was to expand on the comment about needing courage in the boardroom. I think the difference, one of the major differences that's kind of an aha for us from a business perspective is in the boardroom, every person is equal and there's no one in charge. I'm the chairman of the board of DocuSign. I'm a facilitator. I am not a dictator. I don't make the decisions. I bring people to consensus decisions. And when you have 8 or 12 people where no one's in charge, when you come up against tough issues, you've got to get people to coalesce around a point of view. And that takes time. And sometimes it also takes courage to stand up and say, this is the reason why we should do something a certain way. And how does other people feel about this? Or things don't seem to be going right. And we don't seem to be addressing it. So what do we do about that? And everyone has that equal voice. So, it's easier to lean back and let others do that when there's not a set expectation of your boss telling you to do something. And when companies get into trouble, people have a tendency to freeze and not go into action because there are multiple ways that you might be able to solve something. So you don't have somebody taking the hill and you're following them. And that dynamic in the boardroom is very different than if you're in a company, you know who you work for, you know who your boss is, you know what it takes to keep your job. And because of that, boards sometimes when companies are in trouble, take too long to make decisions. So because I have a lot of board experience and also CEO experience, I try to be courageous in the boardroom, not giving answers, but just facilitating to get to a yes or a no on something. And it's not necessarily easy to do that. It does require you to build trust and relationships with people outside the boardroom, because when you're all in the foxhole and the shells are coming, you want to know that you can have a level of trust with others. Yeah. So it's a great question. Did you all hear the question in the back there too? Actually, in the public environment, the only stakeholder that we are responsible for from a law perspective is the shareholder. The other stakeholders are inputs to that output, right? So you take great care of employees because then they deliver great products and services, and then customers buy them, and then you make money and your shareholders get value. So think about, I know in the ESG world, we talk about all these different stakeholders, employees and customers, influencers to these companies. But the shareholder value creation today in the law is the only thing that if you're a board member and you don't focus on creating shareholder value, you can go to jail. And I always keep that in mind whenever I'm making decisions from a board perspective. And the others are the inputs to that output. Yeah.
Do you care to comment on that?
I don't necessarily consider that a board. I think it's a major dictator versus a board. The majority shareholders, it's important that even if you're a majority shareholder, that you look out for all the shareholders as well. It's not just about you. So I just kind of scratch my head when I see things like that. But only in the Bay Area do we seem to have those things happen. Yes. It is not from a legal perspective. The best practices for larger private companies operate just like public. There is definitely more focus on human capital in the private sector. And part of that is because a lot of the companies are owned and founded by families, right? So the people are a really important asset, and from that perspective, not just an input to the output. But the bigger private companies operate more like the public. Yes.
Retirement. I've had the opportunity to see some of these boards in action, and it's people that are kind of been around for like 20 years. And just given the evolution of what's going on these days, things are moving rapidly. It seems to me like, something needs to be talked about at least about this.
Yeah, it's a great question. This is about mandatory retirement from boards. There are some board members that will hang on the side of the building after their sell date, I call it, which is a problem for companies. And there are many companies that don't have term limits for their directors. And I think the problem with mandatory retirement from an age perspective is not everybody is equal, right? There are some directors that I've served with in their 70s and up toward their 80s that are still very viable, valuable, knowledgeable, and have a lot of experience. But there are others that aren't, right? That don't maintain that level of being able to stay up on the game. So I look at it more from a time perspective. For example, when I join a board, I actually tell the CEO or the chairman of that board, my tenure will be somewhere between 8 and 12 years max. And the reason why I say that is I never want to leave a board if a company's in a lurch, right? If there's a problem, I would stay through that. So let's say I'm planning on leaving at 8 years. If that company gets into trouble, say financially or from a market perspective, I'll stay to help get them out. So it doesn't look like there's more to something than there is if you have board members that start fleeing off the board. But I typically never stayed longer than 12 years on a board because I think you're not independent after you're on a board for a long period of time. And it's better to repot and let those boards refresh. But I sit on some boards today, big boards that are, very well run companies like Costco, right? $350 billion market cap company. Charlie Munger is on. Meetings. And his head is still on, he's still in the game, but he's been on the board for like 40 years. So he's, to me, he's not necessarily very independent either anymore. But I would say that refreshment is a really important aspect, and we should have rules of the road to help people move on. Yeah.
Can you talk about with ESG, it seems like it's very polarized. We're going to shut down everything, no natural gas, no fracking, nothing. And finding a middle road. Lyft, I know as an example, it's fascinating. California Air Resources Board said you need to be 90% by 2030, imposing all kinds of costs on the company.
Correct.
Company, of course, is going to the ballot box. And we have Gavin now against the California Democratic Party. It just seems like a complete mess rather than finding a middle road.
Yeah, it's a great shout out. We have a tendency to victimize companies from a government perspective instead of having companies work hand in hand with government. So it's a win-win all the way around. And Lyft, it's huge cost to our company. And the other thing is all about whether our drivers are independent contractors or employees, and those drivers make those decisions. We poll our drivers, 80% of our drivers have other jobs, and they do this as a part-time job, not a full-time job. And so there's a lot of government intervention into businesses today. And there's also a lot of activist intervention into businesses that for the shareholder that has 1% of a public company, putting together, sort of activist positions to try to disrupt companies with very little ownership of those companies. So it's a tough time for corporate America, I think, in trying to kind of weave through some of these areas that there's a lot of gray area that we have to deal with. But I believe companies have to be courageous, again, to the discussion we had before and about doing the right thing for their constituents. They're not just their shareholders, but their stakeholders as well. So, yeah, we've got one here and then. then we'll go to the back. You're next.
What were the lessons learned from Theranos for board members?
Oh, my. Well, one of the lessons I learned is if I'm going to wear black, I don't go solid black on everything that I wear. And I don't dye my hair like a platinum blonde either. So, you know, I think the lessons learned are we shouldn't get wrapped up in what people say. We should judge what's right and what's wrong by what people do. I met Elizabeth Holmes very early when she first became, you know, the darling of tech America, right, and healthcare. And I was at a JP Morgan conference, and she was interviewed by Jamie Dimon, the CEO. And my husband was with me, and I, you know, again, I kind of have a sniff test on people and what they say and how they do that. And I looked at my husband after she finished talking. I said, "That's the biggest bunch of bullshit I've ever heard in my entire life." And you know, I was just floored by how all these guys are like hanging on every word she is saying. It was amazing to me. And I know Jamie Dimon really well. I mean, he's been a banker, one of my bankers at companies that I've run for years. And so afterwards, when he was fawning about her, I said, "You know, Jamie, I think that's the biggest bunch of bullshit I ever heard." And he starts yelling at me saying, "You're crazy, Maggie. That's not true. She's going to change the world, blah, 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 blah." And I will tell you, when she got into trouble, Jamie Dimon sent me a dozen roses and said I was the only one that called her out. So anyway, that's my Theranos story. Do you want to stand up? I could probably hear you better. Oh, there we go.
So in a founder-led board, for instance, a lot of times the founder can be more emotionally involved and have a greater voice as well. Have you run into a situation where, you know, the direction, you know, the right answer, but then somehow the founder to you know, put that back on the right track?
Yeah, it's a great question. I sit on several boards today, several public and private boards that are founder-led. And I spend a lot of time with these founders before I decide to join a board, because I'm not ceremonial to just be there to let them do whatever they want to do. I'm a bit of an acquired taste because I have a lot of experience. So they have to be comfortable with my voice, and I want to be comfortable with theirs. And, you know, Lyft, we talked about Lyft a little bit. You know, there's two co-founders that own majority of the company, but they listen to their board, even when it's tough love. And sometimes they have to shift and pivot. And sometimes you have to say things 7 times, 7 different ways with founders to get them to come around to where you are. But if you come from the perspective that it's in the best interest of them as shareholders, in addition to their stakeholders, you can usually find a win-win path. I have interviewed with several founders of very large companies that are tech, and I don't need to name them for you. I think you probably all know who some of them are. And I chose not to join those boards. And people would say, "Well, you're crazy. You know, that's like one of the top companies. Why wouldn't you join that board?" And I look now at how some of them are in trouble, because you know, you can't live by the emperor has no clothes. And you don't just get away with it because you're worth a lot of money. So you have to do the right things the right way. So it's a delicate balance, but I think we get to vote with our feet, you know, based upon our decisions. So I'm trying to be sensitive to time here. I think we have a few more minutes. Any other questions? There's one here.
Yeah, curious your thoughts on a limited population of executives serving on multiple boards. Is that ultimately good, not so good? You know, just your thoughts on that.
Well, I guess my thoughts would be, I think it's pretty positive since I sit on a bunch of them today. I think part of it is you can bring experiences to the table when you sit on multiple boards, and you get to see trends that start to develop in certain industries that you can actually bring those ideas up to these other boards before they've even seen them. So I don't think it's negative. I think the big thing is it's about the amount of time you have. You have to have the amount of time if a company gets into trouble to help them. So when you join a board, even if it's a private board and it's 5 to 7 meetings a year versus a public, which is 8 to 12, I'll tell you, if a public company gets into trouble, I've been on public company boards where you're meeting once a week, right? You know, we just had DocuSign. I went in as interim CEO for 4 months as chairman of the board when we had to do a CEO replacement. And these are not easy things to do. And yeah, I sit on 7 boards. I got 6 grandchildren, a husband, I run an inn. And oh, by the way, I'm running a Fortune 500 company. It's crazy. So I had to go to my boards, my other boards, and I said, I need to be on hold for about 90 days while we do the search. I'll stay involved. I'll read the materials. A couple of the committees that I chair, including a couple audit committees, I had other members of the audit committee take over as chair while I was doing this, because you have to be able to donate the time, you know, when companies get into trouble. So the good news is I'm no longer CEO of DocuSign. We hired somebody. He started last week. He's hit the ground running. It's all good. But the time sink is what you have to really watch out for with multiple boards. Yeah.
Have you had to resign from a board before? And if so, how do you feel about it?
Yes, I have resigned from boards. If I actually lose faith in the CEO and I lose faith in the direction the company's going in, and it's not really willing to see that perspective, I think it's the right thing to do to resign. Now, I typically will try to just not stand for reelection. There's been very few cases, maybe one case in my entire career of the 51 boards I've served on, where I left before my term was up. But I usually just don't stand for reelection. And that way it's normal course of business, so to speak. Yeah. Yes.
Let's just start with a board that's been together for a long time, old white men. So are there strategies that you would use with that group before you bring in the new member? Like, how do you prep the ground for change?
Yeah, it's a little easier today because there's a big push for it. But in most of the cases, I was the first woman on every board that I served on, right? And I always weaseled my way onto the Nom and Gov committee. So over time, when I showed them that, I don't have 3 heads and I'm not a fire breathing dragon and I can actually help and add value, it makes them more comfortable, right? So I was always pushing myself forward with one hand and I yank another woman behind me onto these boards. And I do think that there's still some clubbiness to a number of companies that is majority white males on the boards. But as you can tell, I'm not very shy. So I have a lot of experience, so I can jump into these conversations and add value, and that builds respect, which also builds the opportunity for them to open up that aperture to more. Yeah, I'm not very patient, but I give it a couple meetings because I want to see the dynamics first before you do things. When you're in, especially public boards, because there is no one in charge. You want to see who the de facto leaders are, and it's not necessarily the board chair or even some of the committee chairs. They're just influencers on boards that just, you got to get that dynamic and understand it first. So, okay, I think I'm done. Thank you so much. It's good to see all of you. Well, I think we can get seated unless you want to go to the bathroom or anything. No. Okay. All right. Good. Great meeting you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. Thank you for coming.
My stuff here.
Okay, the last part of the program before our reception, we have a great panel. And Evan and the panelists, if you will all come up. And for those of you that didn't hear, Maggie's Inn is Grand Reserve Inn in the Shenandoah Valley, not the one in Virginia, the one in California. No, let's start now.
Okay. I think we just start. take a seat. No, anywhere is good. Okay, we are live after all this moving. I'm kind of used to it now. So the final panel, before we eat and have a nice reception, maybe some wine and beer, is about ESG. So some of you have asked about ESG. Our keynote talked a little bit about ESG, but what we have done is assembled an expert panel on ESG. So we have Monique, who is running the SEC here in San Francisco in the regional office. And so we have the regulator, and the regulator is very active on this ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. And we can talk a little bit about what they are doing. There's a very important climate change disclosure proposal that is being worked and very disputed among the market, right? What does it mean? And how do companies have to disclose these issues? Brandon is a partner with Freshfields, the law firm. So he advises companies when they go public, when they are public, about what to do about ESG. And he can tell us about how terms have changed and how to advise clients on these issues, because this is an important issue today. We have also here with us people from PJT Cambridge. Just making sure I have your name, Sheena. It's the first time we've met. We talked on the phone. But Sheena is from PJT Cambridge. For those of you who don't know, PJT Cambridge is an advisor to companies on how to deal with institutional investors. This is a very important element today in corporate governance, because institutional investors have such a strong role on how governance is run that companies have to understand, how do large institutional investors think? How do activist investors think? How do other types of investors, and there's a lot of different types of investors and pressures that companies have to deal with. And finally, we have the investor, right? Lori here is with Parnassus Investments, which is an investment firm based in San Francisco, and she does investments with a focus on ESG. So we have a very balanced panel, and hopefully we can have a discussion to talk about ESG, what this is, and if you have any questions, we're going to try to accommodate everything, but I'm very excited about this because I do a lot of corporate governance at Hastings. And one of the bigger questions on corporate governance is this ESG, right? Which is the G at the end, but the ENS has become like the leading topic. So Monique, why don't you tell us about what the SEC is doing? Maybe let's start off with the climate change disclosure proposal, and then we'll go from there.
Commissioner or any other member of the staff. Let's see how many hands I can have here as well. So just for deeper background, when the SEC proposes new rules, the proposal is published on sec.gov and in the Federal Register. A proposing release typically contains the text of the proposed rule or amended rule, along with a discussion of the issue or the problem that the proposal is designed to address. Then there's a public comment period for a certain period of time. The SEC considers the public's input on the proposal as it determines its next steps. In March 2022, the SEC proposed rules to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosure. So those proposed rules are intended to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures to address investor needs for more information. And I'll give you just a little information from the adopting release, just so it can get really deep and probably pretty boring, so I'll try to stay high level. So many issuers currently seek to provide this type of information to meet investor demand, but current disclosure practices are fragmented and inconsistent. The proposed rules would help issuers more efficiently and effectively disclose these risks, which would then benefit both investors and issuers. Generally, the proposed rule amendments would require a domestic or foreign registrant to include certain climate-related information in its registration statements and periodic reports, such as its Form 10K. And the type of information that those may include would be climate-related risks and their actual or likely material impacts on the registrant's business, strategy, and outlook. The registrant's governance of climate-related risks and relevant risk management processes, the registrant's greenhouse gas or GHG emissions, which for certain filers with respect to certain emissions would be subject to assurances. Certain climate-related financial statement metrics and related disclosures in a note to its audited financial statements. And finally, information about climate-related targets and goals and a transition plan, if any. So the proposed disclosures are similar to those that many companies already provide based on a broadly accepted disclosure framework, such as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The comment period has been extended a couple times on these rules. I think initially back in May, and then again recently due to some problems, I think, collecting the comments. I believe they're set to close this week. And I think you're going to ask me a little bit about the comments. So it's certainly not something I'm tasked with doing, reviewing those comments, but I understand that there are thousands of them. And the public can actually go and look at the comments. They're categorized on the sec.gov website. They come from all walks of life. I mean, literally there are state representatives, congresspeople, industry reps, individuals, professors, businesses, climate groups that have submitted comments. And I think equally diverse are the substance of those comments. I think people mainly hear in the news about the criticism, but there are actually a lot of people providing comments that the rules don't go far enough. People want particular segments strengthened, but then there are criticisms related to constitutionality, harm to investors and industries.
Okay, yeah, and I don't know, maybe it has been the most commented rule ever.
I've heard that. I can't I can't affirm, but I have a sense that there are quite a few comments. Thousands is probably an understatement.
Yeah, and for those of you who are law students, there are dueling letters from professors. On one band, there's like 22 professors that are against it or criticizing it. On the other end, there's 30 professors. So it's a very, very polarized debate, but we're not going to bore you all
Yeah,
on this.
it's interesting to try to do sort of a geographic survey of where the commenters come from. I've done that a little bit, but nothing I'm willing to share. So,
well, like everything, the debates are getting polarized politically everywhere, and this is another place where political polarization is very strong. But maybe let's move, Lori. I want to ask you, because this is something that people struggle with. You know, what is ESG? One of the criticisms is that somebody banded this name together maybe 20 years ago, actually the UN, and you know, it's environmental issues, it's social issues, and it's governance, but now it's all taken together. So as an investor, how do you think about it? How do you make your investments that are ESG friendly or ESG in a category, and how do you divide that so people can understand what they're investing in?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I would say, just starting off, having been involved with ESG investing for now almost upwards of since 2005, but actually started after I was finishing up my undergrad at UCLA, an intern at Parnassus. And at that time, Parnassus was a firm that really started in the ESG arena back in the 80s. So having an opportunity to join at that point and then go off and work in some other related fields and coming back to Parnassus in the mid 2005 period. ESG at that time was really about exclusionary scrapes, avoiding what was called STEM stocks. So many of you may know in this industry, it was avoiding companies that have exposure to things like alcohol and tobacco, nuclear weapons, gambling, more recently fossil fuels. But I think, over the years, so at Parnassus, we still exclude companies based on some of those screens. But, it's really been a focus now more on positive screening. So helping investors to utilize ESG to really find exceptional companies. And so for us, we put capital work generally for at least 3 to 5 years, often holding stocks upward of a decade in some cases. So looking at a holistic approach of a company, understanding what are they doing around their E, S, and G can give us an indicator how high quality is this investment opportunity, and identify material risk and reputational risks that could affect that company's financial performance. So it's very integrated into our process. We're looking for, ideally companies that have very wide competitive moats, increasingly relevant products and services, management teams that are along with long-term shareholders, but also these ESG factors. So I think, a lot of the focus today, as you're hearing in the news, companies are doing ESG. They're attempting, to do one of those two strategies that I mentioned. Now, the third area that I would say we also actively focus on is really engagement with our companies. And that we have multiple tools that we can interact with our company, whether it be through dialogue, of course, voting all of the proxy statements, as well as having formal engagements on specific topics that we think have an opportunity to enhance that company's long-term performance. And finally, even shareholder proposals. You might have read a little bit about that, but that's also been growing in numbers in terms of filing a shareholder proposal, which would encourage a company to act on a specific recommendation by that shareholder. So all of essentially, that's our approach in a nutshell. There's a lot of different ways of going about this in the industry, and I think that's partly what does create confusion. The other thing I'll say, just finally, when I first started this, we would call a company and ask them about, their employee turnover, or what are you doing around managing your emissions and your carbon footprint, or how do you access, what are you doing on the water front, as it's so critical to your sustaining operations, for instance, in the semiconductor industry or other industries that are in more drought prone areas. And we'd often hear, well, we'll get back to you. We don't have anything, we don't have anyone that really covers those topics. Today, I think there's a lot more information. There's a whole host of third-party research providers, whether it be groups such as MSCI, Sustainalytics, which is owned by Morningstar, and they all put out essentially research on these topics. For us, I think it's certainly an input into our process. They do provide ratings, but we don't rely on those ratings per se. So it is helpful to have that information. But I think that's probably one of the big changes that we've seen.
We're not going to get into ratings.
Yeah.
That's probably the most problematic part of ESG ratings. But you're an active investor. I want to ask, so let's talk about institutional investors, maybe passive investors, how that has changed in terms of ESG, and maybe also activist investors, meaning hedge funds that take positions. And the famous case, I'm sure a lot of you read, the Exxon case, right? That was subject to an activist investor saying that, hey, you should think about the future. And there was a proxy fight, and they removed, 3 or 4 board members. And maybe tell us about the shareholder proposals, how that has changed as well. Maybe you can give us kind of the holistic side of the shareholder front.
Sure, I'll try not to give a lecture on each of those because those are pretty broad topics. And just, by way of context, I advise mostly public companies who sit on the other side of some of the engagements that Lori referenced. And so I have the vantage point of, hearing what companies are hearing from those large institutional shareholders, whether they're actively managed, more ESG focused, or the largest institutional shareholders like the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets of the world. Investors are a very diverse bunch, but if I could distill, some of their priorities when it comes to ESG and be somewhat reductive about it, I think of it almost like a hierarchy of needs, really starting with board oversight. So there's a very strong focus and desire to understand, is the board evaluating the ESG related risks and opportunities that are relevant to the company? We used to use the word material. We're no longer using that, given its, definition in the legal community, but, the relevant risks and opportunities. That does not mean that there's an expectation of a one-size-fits-all board oversight approach. And in fact, it's very relevant to investors to understand, how did the company think about those ESG risks and opportunities in the context of where oversight is assigned, whether at the full board level or at a committee, or I should say, and or at a committee level? Are there themes or topics that are allocated out to different committees? Are there specific functions like reporting? Is that assigned to the audit committee? So there's a strong desire to understand that the board is evaluating in partnership with management and then overseeing those
Can I-
risks and
Can I ask you a
opportunities.
question? Because this comes up here and there. Are you seeing directors placed on boards that have to have ESG experience or, expertise?
So I would start by saying, I think any investor will balk at the term ESG expertise
Okay.
because of where he started. E, S, and G are
Yeah.
all very different, right? So I think hopefully most boards of public companies have core governance expertise. I think I've never seen an investor say to a company, we want you to put a director on a board who has this one unique, skill set. And that's for a couple of reasons. First, again, thinking about this in the context of broader strategy and risk management, having one director who has one, unique skill set, I think there's a view, and actually would love Lori's view on this. I think there's a perception that doesn't necessarily contribute to a holistic understanding and evaluation and strategic thinking if you have, you're essentially asking one individual to kind of be the brains on a particular issue. That does not mean that if a company sees, energy transition as really fundamental to its business strategy, it's not valuable to have that expertise on the board, right? But it's not de facto, seeking expertise in A, B, C, D areas, cybersecurity, environmental, management, et cetera, at the exclusion of other skills. And in fact, investors increasingly are asking companies and their boards, what are you doing to upskill your directors to ensure they stay up to date in this very rapidly evolving area? Not just there's a lot of evolving science, right? Biodiversity is becoming a huge issue of investor attention that probably a lot of boards don't necessarily know about. So I think there's a perception and a strong view among most investors that we see of a much more holistic approach to board skills than an isolated set of environmental, social, or governance skills.
So the other thing that we are witnessing, particularly after the pandemic, is the S, the social part. And maybe the employees have been very vocal about what's going on in companies, how to approach political issues. And so, Brandon, why don't you tell us what are the internal pressures from companies in addition to the external pressures, and how do you think about it from an ESG perspective? Maybe are you putting policies in place that set the expectations of employees, and how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because of the three prongs, the S is probably the one that has the most subjectivity to that. And I think because of that, it also invites the most sort of diverse voices. So, internal employee pressures, external investors, customers, vendors, all those are, some of the voices in the room and putting pressure on certain social issues. And I think Maggie in her keynote touched on some of those, right? So the diversity and inclusion, the employee attrition and retention, return to work, compliance with policies. And I think in particular, in compliance with policies, one of the things we saw, 2 or 3 years ago was a lot of companies, in reaction to some public events, sort of adopted racial policies. And in return, I think we saw some interesting developments where companies that, they adopted these policies, but maybe not have put in place the right or put in place enough oversight in terms of compliance with these policies. And then you saw some shareholder proposals on those policies, and some companies failed them and some companies passed it. But I think that's an example of there's managing the different voices in the room, and this puts I think pressure on the management and the board to sort of really distill some of these these voices and to think about sort of what the priorities are in terms of putting the business in the best position. And, that might result in disappointing a group. It might result in disappointing some of your employees, but you have to balance that with sort of what the overall objective is of the business. So I think that boards are put in tough positions and are increasingly tough positions on the S issue as they're thinking about sort of all the different voices.
Let me go back to you and ask you about something that the SEC has been very vocal, which is the SEC ESG enforcement task force. So basically the SEC said, so the SEC said, there's a lot of people that claim to have ESG, and we think there's a lot of greenwashing, meaning what is this stuff? And you're basically selling to the public things that they are investing and they are not the real thing. So why don't you tell us about what type of cases you have enforced, because there's already been cases that have gone through, and what are you looking at that to sanction companies for wrongdoing?
Sure. I mean, first, with respect to the task force, which was formed back in March of 2021, it does sit within the enforcement division of the SEC, but it works with all the other divisions. It works with other regulators, both national and foreign. And it sort of has a broader task than just bringing cases. So, you won't see, I don't think you'll see a press release that says the ESG task force has brought this case. So the ESG task force is something that works, I'd say, a little more behind the scenes and is really focusing on what others have mentioned about what the material issues that are important for investors. And it's clear that ESG issues, climate issues have become important to investors. It's interesting, thinking to Lori mentioned, like going back to the 1980s. I don't have cases going back that far, but I think probably most people in this room are old enough to remember the BP oil spill. But most of the people in this room probably don't remember the SEC case related to the BP oil spill. So just a little background, this dates well before the task force, well before any of these climate rules were proposed. But in late 2012, the SEC actually filed a settled case against BP for making materially misleading statements about the flow rate of oil spilling from the Deepwater Horizon oil rig. And I believe that's still one of the largest oil spills in US, if not world history. And in that case, the commission alleged that BP made fraudulent public statements indicating that the flow rate was about 5,000 barrels per day. It reported this figure in public filings, public data, but its own internal data actually indicated that the flow rate was as high as 146,000 barrels of oil a day. So the commission alleged that the BP executives made numerous public statements after the oil spill, giving incorrect information about the oil spill. So I sort of think of this as one of the early ESG cases, even though it wasn't known as an ESG case at that time. And BP was actually charged with 10B intentional fraud violations and paid a $525 million penalty. And so thinking other cases, there's also another case that shifts gears a little bit out of the public company space into more of the investment advisor space. And I think back about in 2008, the SEC brought a settled case against Pax World Management. And in that case, the SEC alleged that Pax World, which was an SEC registered investment advisor to several socially responsible mutual funds, purchased at least 10 securities that the fund's socially responsible investing restrictions, or SRI restrictions, prohibited them from buying, contrary to the representations that it made to investors and the boards of the funds. And again, this was another settled case and that included a penalty against Pax World. But I think those two are good examples of cases that sort of reflect the SEC doing what it does, enforcing the rules that are actually in place. I think a lot of news articles sometimes are accusing the SEC of trying to create new law or create a new space. But the work we're doing in this area is actually enforcing long-standing rules, the fraud rules, the investment advisor rules. We actually don't have any new rules in place to enforce because thousands of people are commenting on them, and it'll take a while. I could talk about more, but let's, if we have time.
Yeah, and I know that somebody asked about what are the lessons of Theranos, but you were the one to take down Theranos for fraud.
I don't know that I did that alone, but
You in your SEC office.
I could talk about some lessons of Theranos, but I don't think that's why we're here
Yeah,
today.
no, I just thought how timely that you're here. So another thing that I think is interesting about the what's going on in ESG is about, maybe I'm wrong at the time, but maybe 6 months ago, we have a very strong anti-ESG movement. And it's been very strong in the media. We have very big business personalities calling out ESG, right? Big investors, big executives saying this is all a fraud, this is all nothing. And so I want to have your take on, how do you see this? And particularly maybe you, Lori, that you've been in the ESG world, how do you take this new anti-ESG movement that is very strong and unfortunately now is become a very political issue, and a lot of states, for example, Texas and Florida and Louisiana, have divested from investors like BlackRock, saying we don't want to follow your ESG mandates and we think that's wrong. So can you have a taste of what's going on in the market with this anti-ESG movement?
Sure. I mean, I think it's a bit unfortunate that this has turned political. Obviously, we've got an upcoming midterm elections, and I think there's probably a heightened amount of news on this topic right now. But at the essence of what you're trying to accomplish from an ESG perspective, I think there's, as I mentioned before, I think there's quite a bit of confusion in the market given the variations and strategies that are being deployed around ESG. What may be included in one strategy from a company may not be included in another. There's obviously very different approaches with screening, with ESG integration. Some are more focused on engagement or even impact. So I think that does certainly create a bit of confusion, and it really is the burden on the investor to understand if you're deploying capital into that strategy, what is their approach? Look at those top 10 or 15 holdings, look at their full list and see, do those really reflect the companies that I think represent what's being marketed and communicated? Is that matching up with perspectives? So I think there's right now, unfortunately, a bit more onus on the actual investor to really understand what it is that's in those portfolios. And so with that level of confusion, I think that's sort of excavating the issue in the press. Now, at the end of the day, having done this for many years and developed a very long-term track record, for our perspective, investing in companies and utilizing ESG factors to assess those companies is very much additive. I don't see it as political when you're trying to analyze, a company, for instance, within their human capital management, looking at how is this company able to attract and retain top talent, looking at specific metrics, employee engagement or human turnover ratio. Those are factors that we can assess. Is this company going to be able to deliver, the type of innovation in the future? I mean, think about a technology company. It's very dependent upon their ability to attract and retain talent. And so incorporating that into our assessment, our holistic assessment of a company is extremely valuable to then be able to discern, is this the type of quality company that we can hold in a portfolio for 3, 5, even 10 years in the future in a concentrate portfolio? So for us, it's very much long-term. We think it's additive to our process. It has certainly, we've seen the long-term track record in which is the case. Now, there's also a principles part and a values. And so, certainly I think, investing behind your values is also part of ESG. And so I think, that's another part of the equation to consider as well.
So maybe Sheena, specifically, BlackRock has been criticized because, at some point they managed $10 trillion. So it's the biggest player. Larry Fink, the CEO, issues a letter every year to 500 CEOs, and it's a very influential letter. And now they have a new strategy that is giving the votes to the beneficial owners. Do you think that is an approach to put pressure out of them? And I think yesterday, he just said that about 25% of their ownership is being given to this voice to their beneficial shareholders. So it's a very big trend, but what do you make out of this? This is a big issue in governance. And how do you think about what BlackRock and Vanguard and others are doing in order to have this response?
Yeah. Well, I I don't want to speak for BlackRock,
Yeah.
but and you're right. It isn't just BlackRock, even though they're, the biggest, they're the most well-known, but Vanguard and State Street are doing this as well. These investors have been under pressure for a very long time from multiple sides due to the concentration of their holdings in public companies. So I think
Maybe you can give the number just so people understand that the size.
so the stat I'm aware of, I think was 2017. So it's probably changed, but it was something like 20% of all public companies were at the time held by those three. So I think in some ways this isn't a huge surprise if you kind of look at the trajectory of the pressure over a long time. I don't want to say there is a political element to it, because I don't want to, again, speak for BlackRock, but, I think what this actually is, interestingly enough, going to result in, at least in the near term, is actually more reliance by some investors on proxy advisor voting policies. So I think there's actually one of the pressure sources is from some, I would say, more sitting on the kind of political right side of things, actually, pressuring investors to these big investors to, reduce their power, essentially saying, they have a woke agenda, they have too much power, we need to undercut their power. But this actually, again, because investors are, one of the ways in which they are offering the option for their clients to vote is actually just by applying a proxy advisor policy, many of which are actually very pro ESG, if you want to use those terms. Again, I say that's in the short term. We will certainly see some evolution on that front as more investors perhaps opt to take back their votes, maybe build up their stewardship teams to enable more informed voting. But I think there's actually a lot of divergent dynamics that I think could come out of this it's very, very new, but we're watching very closely.
Mhm. Brandon, any thoughts on this trend?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also interesting to think about when this trend started in the context of the global economy, right? Because really, I mean, it started in February or March when it really started to become publicized, politicized, as the economy started to turn the other way. And, in some respects, I wonder how much of the economy has influenced the momentum behind this and the fact that, people's, accounts are no longer what they were a year ago, or even, 3 months before that. And to me, I think in some respects, it suggests that this may be, an economic trend that is impacting kind of where we are, in addition to kind of the fact that it's an election year. So, but, the way I've seen companies deal with it is, again, this is another factor that's influencing boards' decisions in the boardroom in terms of, putting their company in the best position and, making sure that their, company is attractive to investors. So I think there's a lot of different undercurrents to it.
Okay. We've got about 15 minutes left. I want to make sure that you have time to ask questions. I mean, it is really a top-notch panel. So if you have questions, just jump in. Otherwise, we'll keep going. There's so much ESG content that we can go on for hours. Yeah, here.
I feel like I might be being questioned by a member of Congress. Both good questions. I think so many factors go into what the SEC considers when they vote on a penalty in the case. I think you make an excellent point. I'm not aware of the rationale of where they landed on that penalty in that case. And could you repeat the second part of your question? I think it's something that I know my office is always striving to find an individual responsibility. And I do think this current commission, it looks more for individual responsibility, as does the Department of Justice right now under Merrick Garland. When it's there, we do it. When we have the evidence to prove it, it's tough. I mean, you know, executives are cloaked behind so many layers of protection. And I'm not saying every executive does something wrong, but it's a really, really challenging to prove. I don't think I'm capable of responding to that one, but I hear your point.
All right. Other questions? Yeah, in the back there.
I mean, I think it's an excellent question. I would say, you know, certainly we recognize that as a long-term investor that no company is perfect, and ESG is a journey. You're not going to have an overnight change at a company, but taking actions. And I think it is really table stakes today for companies to be able to communicate what they're doing around ESG. And certainly as investors are looking to put capital behind companies that have very strong ESG practices, those companies that aren't doing a good job effectively communicating that will be potentially at risk of not attracting that long-term capital. So I think as a board, it's very imperative. I would concur with much of what I heard with Maggie prior to this panel, and that, you know, the board really does have to actively be very proactive around understanding an oversight role of the company's ESG strategy and helping that company to evolve. Because at the end of the day, you know, improving upon those factors will lead to longer term sustainable growth and success for those companies. So I do think it is a board level item, and it needs to be thought about carefully within the board on a consistent basis. This is not just a side activity. Finally, it needs to really be integrated with that company's business strategy. You know, those companies that are most effective are integrating these directly into the long-term strategic outlook for the company. And so that's where you can really see positive influence for taking action on these ESG factors.
Yep.
So that's just outsourcing. 30 others. I should give the comments.
Question.
Sounds like a question for your law school class.
Well, let me. Well, I'm just going to say that it's a great question because the debate, for example, I'll give you another topic that I'm looking at, which is mining. And so, for example, lithium mining, right? So we are transitioning to electric vehicles, but the United States has no mining of lithium, and everything is in Canada, in Australia, in South America. And China is very active, and there's in play an industry, right? So how do you approach these issues is very important. And what is ESG, right? Like if we think that electric vehicles are the future and you look at Tesla, well, if Ford and GM is going to go that direction, you actually need rare earth minerals, and you need these metals. And so people have to understand that mining is important. And as you said, going fracking and other renewable and energy intensive industries is important. And I think this is one of the problems of ESG. And as you said, I kind of agree that putting it outside of the United States and letting other countries do the dirty job. There are mines planned in North Carolina, in Nevada, but they aren't permitted. Why? Because you got indigenous, groups or environmental groups that are saying, we shouldn't do this here. Well, what do we want? Do we want, electrical cars or what? So I think it's a great question.
Kind of build on that, just again, from the corporate investor perspective, we see more and more investors becoming more sophisticated on the kind of what I would think of as like a constellation of issues that surround that. So, I mean, I can't speak to, I don't want to speak to kind of state energy policy, but, if you have a, mining company that's primary, it's housed in US, its primary operations are in Indonesia or Chile, increasingly investors and a broader set of stakeholders, including, civic groups and the like, are pressuring companies to pay attention to and actually act on things like human rights, labor rights, other issues that contribute to what I would call sustainability of a company in a broader context than just, them kind of the outsourcing element of that. So I think there is a growing sophistication in kind of evaluating this constellation of environmental and social issues that surround a lot of these activities, including whether they're, in the US, because those issues still matter, or if they're abroad.
Yep. People are all in debt here. All things the same. And of course, we always think everyone thinks the same. I have the amount of time to do the right thing or make the right. I just can't abide by it. Yeah. I just view it as a bad, and I bet 5 years before. Yeah, anyone keen to comment? I mean, I think it's a fair criticism.
I mean, my only comment there would be that I think we enforce the rules that we have. We enforce when people make misstatements. I don't think it's really a SEC that we've taken a stand against ESG. We're looking at what is important to investors today. And you're right, maybe that changes in 10 years, but we're looking at the public disclosures by these companies and whether they're truthful, whether there's any material emissions. So I don't really have a comment or a criticism, but I think the way the SEC acts, part of our mission is to protect investors. I think that the SEC has a job for the rest of its life, regardless of whether ESG is important.
I'll just add to, I think, in terms of ESG, it's obviously been around for a long time. If it's done properly, I think it can add a lot of value in the sense that you are looking at what are the most material factors that are going to affect that company's performance, and also opportunities too. As an investor, we found extraordinary opportunities in companies such as in the water infrastructure filtration space, companies you might have heard of, such as Xylem, Pantera. These are companies that help, for instance, provide pretty mission critical infrastructure for water systems, both domestically with municipality and commercial customers, as well as internationally. With water scarcity, the really focus around clean water. So this was an opportunity that was illuminated to us about 5 years ago. And there are others too, whether it be the agricultural space and some of the technologies there, Certainly, there's a number of different areas that it helps to identify these pretty fantastic investment opportunities. And when we look out over the next decade and beyond, as we continue to decarbonize this economy, it's going to create very significant advantages for investors. And so, ESG investing is very nuanced. There's not a cookie cutter approach, but if done properly, I think it can be extremely additive.
There is a paper recently published this week by Professor David Larker at the Stanford Business School. And they look at the appetite of investors on ESG, and they break it down by age. So they show that the younger investors are really willing to give up returns for ESG, but the older investors are not. So there's a whole different, distinction among the age of people and how they're willing to do it. Yeah. Yeah.
We don't see that compromise between sacrificing performance and generating returns through adding ESG into our investment process. And certainly, I think the market is currently, there's almost $600 billion flowing into ESG funds according to Morningstar in 2021. So I see this trend sort of unabated at this point.
Sure.
I have seen, go ahead, do you want to comment?
No, there's definitely studies. I don't know them intimately, but there's absolutely studies that look at the return of funds over different time horizons and factoring in, ESG factors or not. It's definitely studied. The academics in the room can.
Sorry. I think we have time for one more question. I saw a hand in the back. Yeah.
I can't speak to anything that's non-public. The one thing I'll just say about Theranos, and not even really relevant here, but Theranos was not a public company, so it had a different type of board than the boards that Maggie is talking about. I think she's all public company. There's a difference.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Now it's time to drink and eat. Jerry, you want to say a few words to end it?
Sure. So the food board is actually open. And for those of you who are in virtual audience, your refrigerator is open. But before we go there, I really do want to thank our sponsors once again. We could not do these programs without them. And first, our partners, University of California, Hastings School of Law, and the Bay Area Economic Council, and all of our supporters at UCLA. And our sponsors, our principal sponsor, RSM, our platinum law firm of Allen Matkins, Cathay Bank, Clark Construction, Leap Development, University Credit Union, our silver sponsors, Jackson Square Partners and Warland Investments Company, at the bronze level, Manufacturers Bank and Bruin Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco. Many thanks to all of our sponsors. And one final word before we go to the food board, which is if you did not hear your company's name there, we can fix that for next year. Just let us know. Thank you.